Children rarely realize they are being traumatized while the trauma is actually happening. So they normally think this is normal. They grow up believing anxiety is actually normal, or walking on eggshells is normal. Being afraid to express emotions is normal to them. So feeling responsible for everybody else's happiness is normal to them. And another thing is suppressing pain is actually normal to them. And then something happens. Adulthood hits, they are being hit by adulthood, and suddenly relationships become very complicated. Emotions feel so overwhelming most of the time, and trust becomes difficult, and they don't even fully understand why. Because childhood doesn't always stay in childhood, you know? Sometimes it follows people into adulthood quietly and into marriages and friendships, parenthood, self worth, and identity crisis issues with children, or faith, identity, like I said, and even the way they love others starts showing up in those experiences. Welcome to the Triage Table Podcast. My name is Caleb, and I am your host for today. And on this podcast today, we have real conversations, normally on this podcast, about life, healing, relationships, emotional struggles, um, things to do with psychology, faith, personal growth, and the hidden battles that most people actually choose not to talk about in public or whatever they are, and they just carry it within their hearts silently. Now, this is not a place for pretending, or it's not a place for perfection. This is a place where we talk about honestly, or honesty, or we talk honestly also about what it means to be human and the things that we carry every single day and how it affects our life, you know? So, and today we are actually talking about the emotional impact of childhood trauma. Not just the dramatic kind people usually imagine, for example, but the quiet kind as well. So, the hidden kind that and the kind people laugh about publicly, but they cry about it privately. So, welcome to this podcast. And also, I meant to talk about the kind that shapes personalities, fears, insecurities, and relationships years later. So, whatever you're listening from right now, maybe you could be driving, you are working late night shifts, or you are probably wearing earphones trying to escape your thoughts for a while. Let's just say you're just chilling, right? Maybe you're listening because you are trying to understand yourself or someone that you love. Either way, I'm glad you're here. So let's talk. Let's have a talk, like, you and me having a normal interaction. All right. I tend to think one of the biggest misconceptions about trauma is that people think trauma only counts if it was extreme, you know? But trauma is not about what happened to you. Sometimes it's about what never actually happened for you. Some people were never comforted emotionally, or never reassured, never protected, never listened to, never hugged enough by their parents or the people that they cared about. They were never told things like, I am proud of you. And when a child grows up emotionally, uh, they feel so unseen. Uh, something inside them slowly starts to change, and it becomes a big thing because children learn who they are, though they or through the way they are actually treated. A child who constantly feels ignored may grow up believing my feelings don't actually matter to anybody, and a child constantly criticized may grow up believing I'll never be enough, for example. And a child abandoned emotionally may grow up terrified of rejection. And many adults today are actually, or they're still reacting emotionally from wounds they received before they even understood emotions properly. Some People grew up in homes where love felt very conditional. You were appreciated when you performed quite very well, or when you did something good, and the only way that you felt loved is when somebody, or like your father or your mom, appreciated you. When, for example, you got good grades in high school or in primary school, when you obeyed your parents, when you achieved something. But emotional warmth, safety, and gentleness, those things were greatly missing. And now, as adults, they struggle believing they are lovable without proving themselves first. So they start, to overwork. They do things like overgiving, overachieving. They try to overextend themselves emotionally. I don't know if you get it, but trying to earn a love that they should have received freely as a child or as kids. And honestly, that becomes quite very exhausting, because eventually you realize no amount of achievement heals emotional starvation. Let's talk about hyper independence, for example. A lot of people think independence is always strength, but sometimes hyper independence is actually trauma. I know I got you off guard with that, but some people learned very early that relying on others led to disappointment. So they stopped asking for help. They stopped opening up, and they stopped trusting emotionally. So, and now they say things like, I got myself. I don't need nobody. But deep down, many of them desperately wish someone will just, care for them gently without them having to beg for it. The problem is, trauma teaches people to survive alone, even when they no longer have to. They don't have to. But now they have learned that they have to survive, or they have to be this kind of person even when they don't need to no longer. And that survival mode can quietly ruin relationships, because when someone finally tries to love them genuinely, they don't know how to receive it comfortably. Now, vulnerability feels very dangerous, and dependence feels quite very unsafe. I would tend to think that trust also feels very risky. So they keep people emotionally close enough to avoid loneliness, but far enough to avoid pain. So, and that is a dangerous thing, in my own opinion. Another thing I would love to talk about is another is childhood trauma affects deeply, or where childhood trauma affects deeply is emotional regulation. Some people were never taught how to process emotions safely. Maybe disagreement in the house became shouting. Maybe expressing sadness was called weakness, for example. I love to use the word "for example" a lot. You must have noticed that by now. So maybe fear was mocked, right? Maybe emotions were ignored completely. And children raised in emotional unstable environments often become adults who either suppress emotions completely, or they feel overwhelmed by them. That's why some people explode emotionally over things that you will think they are stupid, tiny little things, but for them is a big thing. Like, why would you react for something that doesn't make sense? But for them, it is a really big thing. It's not always about the small thing. Sometimes it's years of unprocessed emotions finally leaking out. And honestly, many adults are carrying emotional pain that was never given language. They were told to move on, for example, after a breakup, before they ever healed. And that affects a lot of people emotionally. And I mean, we have all been there, where Your best friend tells you, move on, bro. Come on, man. Stop thinking about that girl, or stop thinking about that guy. There are so many guys in the world. There's so many women in the world. That affects you if you don't find some good time to heal yourself. I also don't think that people really understand that aspect quite very well. That's why most people really suffer there. I also think people underestimate how deeply wounds affect children. A child's mind is something that is still worth forming, especially on the identity side. So when harmful words are repeated enough, like for example, you are useless, you're dramatic, you're difficult, you don't just get things, you don't just, what kind of a person are you? You'll never become anything. You are just horrible. Those words just don't just sit there like that. Those words don't just hurt, temporarily. They deeply settle into the nervous system of the kid's life. And years later, those same people may struggle with confidence even when they are successful. Because externally successful people can still be internally wounded. And some adults still hear childhood criticism in their minds every single day, even in silence. I know you didn't know that. Then there are people who experienced emotional unpredictability while growing up. Some days their parents were probably loving, and then there are days that they weren't so much loving. They were a little bit cold to them. Other days they were very angry and they will just do whatever they feel with these kids. So the child never fully relaxed emotionally. They became very watchful. They became too careful, and they became, what is the word I can use? Hyper aware of moods and tone changes. And now as adults, they are overanalyzing everything. A delayed text reply from someone triggers a different tone and a facial expression, or a silence, because their nervous system learned that changes in mood can mean danger. And that kind of emotional hypervigilance is exhausting. So some people look calm externally while internally their mind never fully or never truly rests. You see, something else trauma affects deeply? I would think it's self-worth. Many people don't actually hate themselves loudly. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it sounds like, I'm probably bothering people, I don't deserve better. I don't just tolerate this. Maybe I'm asking for too much. I'm just so difficult to love. Or they may have things like that in their lives. Like, I don't think nobody cares about me. I don't think I'm worth lovable. And honestly, some people stay in unhealthy relationships because unhealthy treatment feels familiar. That's one of the saddest realities of unresolved trauma. Familiar pain can feel safer than an unfamiliar peace. And healing sometimes feels uncomfortable because peace is something that nervous systems never got used to. Some people listening to these podcasts had to grow up too fast as well. They became emotionally responsible for everybody. They became this stronger one, the mature child, who is carrying the burden of everybody. You became the problem solver of the family. At quite a young age, the emotional support system, you were the one who was carrying all that burden. And while everybody else or everyone praised them for being that kind of a mature person, while this person is just 10 or 12 or 9, nobody noticed they were actually overwhelmed. Some children were surviving adult emotions, emotional pressures because they even got the chance to They never got a chance to fully become children. And now, there are adults who struggle resting without, guilt. Adults who feel responsible for everybody else's emotions is exactly what they became. They became also adults who panic when things feel out of control. They also became this kind of adults who don't really know how to receive care because they were always the caregiver emotionally. Let's talk about the abandonment wounds in this instance. Because abandonment doesn't only happen physically, someone can be, present physically but absent emotionally. A parent can provide financially but never be there emotionally or to connect with their children. And children notice this emotional absence quite deeply. Some people grew up constantly craving emotional closeness from unavailable parents. And now they fear abandonment in the relationships constantly. When someone just delays texting them, they start overthinking. They start over-attaching. They overreact to distance, or sometimes they do the opposite completely. They avoid attachment entirely because attachment feels quite dangerous. Because somewhere deep down, they learned that the people I love may leave emotionally. And one thing trauma also affects, I would say, is identity. This is quite very important now. When children grow up in chaotic environments, they often shape themselves around survival instead of authenticity. They become who they need to become in order to avoid pain. So they become this quiet child, the funny child, the kind of overly responsible child, or this kind of a child who is quite very invisible to the people. They become a ghost or the people pleaser, And many adults eventually reach a point where they ask, who am I outside survival mode? That's just a deep question, per se. But because trauma can disconnect people from themselves for years, and social media makes this harder sometimes, because now people compare their healing journey to people online who seem emotionally quite very perfect. Everyone looks confident on social media, happy, healed, secure. You can say whatever you mean, but meanwhile, some people are fighting anxiety attacks privately. Those are the things that people don't really talk about on social media. Battling of overthinking, trust issues, emotional exhaustion, loneliness, depression, childhood memories that still affect them. And they wonder, why can't I just move on? But healing is not a switch. You don't just, flick a switch and, oh, blah, 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 you're healed. Welcome back to the healing journey. It doesn't work like that. And trauma recovery is not linear either. Some wounds take time because they shaped your nervous system during your formative years. That doesn't mean you're weak. It only means you're human. I also want to talk about something else, about how childhood trauma affects relationships. Because many people genuinely want love, but they are terrified of what love requires emotionally. Trust, vulnerability, consistency, honesty, safety. And if someone grew up without emotional safety, relationships can feel, deeply triggering. Some people push people away when they get too close. And most of the time, they push people away that genuinely love them or that they genuinely care about them. Others become emotionally dependent quickly, and others constantly expect betrayal. So, others shut down during conflict because conflict actually does something. It reminds them of childhood fear. And honestly, many couples are not just arguing with each other anymore. Sometimes they are unknowingly reacting from old wounds. And men often carry childhood trauma silently. So, a lot of boys grew up hearing, Be tough. Don't cry. Handle it like a man. So they learned emotional suppression instead of emotional expression. And later in life, that suppression can become anger, numbness, emotional distance, addiction into something like drugs or pornography or whatever things that they can be addicted to. They can be so isolated or difficulty communicating feelings. So some men are not really emotionless as you think. They were simply never taught how to emotionally become safe, or they were never taught to do what we call emotional safety. And that is an important difference. Women can carry deep emotional wounds too, growing up unheard, invalidated, compared constantly. They were made to feel so small or very insignificant or objectified as women, emotionally neglected by their parents. And many women grow up struggling with self-worth, boundaries, people-pleasing abilities or attachment wounds because of what they experienced early emotionally. Childhood experiences shape how safe people feel in relationships later. But here's something important. Trauma is not your fault, and healing eventually becomes your responsibility. I know that sounds quite difficult sometimes to even process in your mind because healing is uncomfortable sometimes. Healing forces people to confront pain they spent years trying to avoid. So healing requires honesty, boundaries, grief, self-awareness, sometimes therapy, and sometimes difficult conversations. Sometimes distance from unhealthy environments, and sometimes healing begins with, simply admitting that things or some things that were done in a certain way hurt me. You can just say that I didn't like it. It really hurt me. That is expressing your emotions because many people minimize their pain for years. They just keep it this small and think it's so insignificant until one day it actually explodes. Especially if others had it worse growing up. But pain is still pain, and emotional wounds deserve attention as well. I think one of the most emotional parts of healing is grieving the child you deserved, grieving the version of you that needed safety, needed gentleness, understanding, emotional protection. There's a deep sadness in realizing younger you or the younger you carried things alone that should never be or should never have been carried alone. But there is also power in becoming aware because awareness breaks cycles and healed people often become safe spaces for others. They parent differently, they love differently, they also communicate differently. They become intentional about not passing pain forward. And honestly, that actually matters deeply. I truly believe healing is possible, but it's not an instant thing. It doesn't happen overnight, or rather, it doesn't happen in a perfect way, but it needs to be genuine. People can learn emotional safety, people can rebuild self worth, people can learn healthier attachments as well. People can actually process grief in the right way. People can break generational cycles. People can rediscover joy, and people can become more than what really happened to them while they were growing up. Your trauma may actually explain some parts of you, but it does not have to become your entire identity. And if nobody told you this before, you deserve love that felt safe. You deserved emotional protection. You deserve to actually feel heard. You deserved gentleness. You deserved to be comforted when you were hurting. And if you didn't receive those things fully, I just want to say I'm really sorry about that. I'm truly sorry because childhood wounds can never leave very deep emotional, can often leave or leave you with deep emotional fingerprints in your life. But your story does not actually end there. it doesn't end there. Healing is possible, and growth is also possible. Peace is possible, and little by little, people really can learn how to live beyond survival mode. It just takes a step by step, meeting the right people, the right community in order to relate that. So the big thing is actually realizing that that is a problem that you have. And that's the beginning. And when you know that that's the thing that I have and I have to work it out, it becomes quite so easy in order to find solutions to it. Thank you so much for spending time with me on the Triage Table Podcast. I have been your host, Caleb, and if this conversation connected you with, this kind of topic, or it connected you with me, share it with someone that may need to hear this as well, because sometimes people hear things that probably they get to it resonates so much with their spirit, because also sometimes people heal simply by realizing they are not alone in what they feel. So I just hope this podcast episode blessed you today and actually spoke to you. If you really love it, please leave a comment, like and share this podcast episode. There are people who really need this compared to, there's so many people who need this kind of help. I hope that it has been so much of a good time together with you. Catch you in the next episode. You can also still get this podcast episode in my Triage Table Podcast in the Spotify app or Apple Podcast or anywhere where you can actually get your audio podcast. Till the next episode, I'll see you. Peace. Take good care of yourself.